This is a video on Karl Marx. While Marx is best known for the Communist Manifesto, economically his most important works are on capitalism and the evolution of capitalism. So the two readings that we'll do out of Karl Marx are from Wage, Labor, and Capital, one of his earlier writings, and then the second work on alienation comes out of Capital, one of his later writings. Wage, Labor, and Capital establishes, first of all, two classes of people or two groups of people. We have workers and capitalists. Marx generally refers to workers as the proletariat and the capitalists as the bourgeoisie. So if you read those terms in Marx, those are equivalent to workers and capitalists. We've been using the terms workers and capitalists in our class, so I'm going to just stick to that in the notes, but they're equivalent in Marx. So in Marx, there's a relationship between these two classes. Workers sell their labor power to capitalists, and capitalists use this labor power to produce stuff. So then life activity for a worker is just a means of securing the worker's existence. Remember Marx's writing starting, 1840, 1850. So we're still coming out of a time where we think of working class wages as being subsistence. So workers have to work in order to secure this subsistence. Labor doesn't count as a part of their life, but is rather a sacrifice of life, would rather be doing something else. So the laborer is a commodity which is bought and sold by the capitalist. The laborer thinks of his time as a commodity that they sell to the capitalist in exchange for money, which they then use to buy goods and services to subsist. And the laborer doesn't generally enjoy in the fruits of their labor except as subsistence. So remember, we're, again, in this time period, a lot of field work, factory jobs, things like that. So Marx quotes then, we see that the social relations within the individuals produce the social relations of production are altered, transformed with the change and development of the material means of production, of the forces of production. Right, so there's this relationship between production and the ownership of production. Capitalists own the means of production, and they buy and sell labor power to produce things. So Marx sees society in general as being produced by this relationship between workers and capitalists. All right, well, what is capital? Marx says that capital is money which is used to buy something only in order to sell it again. Capital exists only within the process of buying and selling. And so the idea here is that capital on its own isn't really doing anything. I gave the example of a coffee shop. If you bought a coffee shop, maybe you rent the building, and then the first machine or capital that you're going to probably buy is a coffee machine. Right, so let's think about the coffee machine. The coffee machine, once you've bought it, doesn't just start producing coffee. You need labor. And then if you want to improve that coffee machine, invent a better one, or improve your technology or your capital, you need more labor or experienced labor to do that. So capital is something that exists. You bought it. What is the purpose of the coffee machine? You want to make coffees and then sell them. So capital exists within the process of buying and selling. Capital can't exist without the laborer because, again, what's that coffee machine doing without a worker? Nothing. Even more developed capital. Think about your laptop. What does your laptop do if you're not working it? It runs some code behind the scenes, stays on or goes into sleep mode, things like that, but it doesn't really do much computing. It doesn't really improve itself or anything like that. It can't transform the capital that it is into other capital without labor working it. Right, so capital can multiply itself only by exchanging itself for labor power, which is what we just described, and by calling wage labor into life. The labor power of the wage laborer can exchange itself for capital only by increasing capital, by strengthening that very power whose slave it is. Increase of capital, therefore, is increase of the proletariat of the working class. So what this means is that, how do we generally think of increases in wages or standards of living? Well, we think of those, or even how do we measure differences in standards of living between countries, uh, or explain why there are differences in incomes. Usually we think of that as differences in capital. Maybe we have better education, better human capital, better machines, and that's why wages tend to be higher in the United States. Well, what this is saying is that in order to have those increase in wages, the wage laborer must increase capital, or improve the capital, thereby strengthening the power of capital, or making capital more valuable, calling more wage laborers into work. So a couple quotes out of Marx here, which you can mostly read on your own, but I'll just sort of interpret them. Um, Marx believes, again, just as we've been talking about, that capital and wage labor are two sides of the same relation, that they condition each other in the same way of the user and the borrower. So how do the user and the borrower, or the lender and the borrower, condition each other? Well, without anyone who wants to borrow money, the lender can't really exist. Without the lender, the borrower doesn't have anyone to borrow from. Furthermore, as the borrower wants to take out more loans, it makes the lender more powerful, more able to set rates, and so on. Right, so likewise, capital and labor. Capital needs labor in order to function, in order to improve. Labor needs capital in order to improve their wages, standards, and living, and so on. So to say that the worker has an interest in the rapid growth of capital means only this: the more speedily the worker augments the wealth of the capitalist, or improves capital, the larger will be the crumbs which fall to him, the greater will be the number of workers that can be called into existence, the more can the mass of slaves dependent on capital be increased. All right, so we talked in class about sort of a slogan that you might hear in some groups: wage labor is slavery. And we talked about some arguments against it, maybe some reasons why people who believe that and say it would believe that and say it. In Marx, wage labor is slavery in the sense that people are giving up their passion pursuits or their ambitions in order to pursue wage labor, in order to stay alive. And because they're essentially coerced into doing it, they have no other option but to starve. This is, in a sense, slavery, but it's not slavery to the same sort of masters that we would think about, or that we studied in the previous weeks. In this sense, it's a slavery to capital, and ultimately, I guess, to the capitalist, the owner of capital, but really to capital itself, because again, the wage laborer needs to improve capital in order to improve wages, but that just calls more wage laborers into existence, and so on. Okay, so moving, you would find a little bit of Marx on exploitation in the first work, Wage, Labor, and Capital. Moving on kind of more into Das Kapital, one of his later works, we talk about exploitation, which just is a result of this process, which we've talked about, as there's these pressures for capital to grow, and capitalists each want to maximize their production and profits. So the value of labor, which is subsistence, is determined by the cost of producing labor power. And if capitalists want to increase their profits or their surpluses, there's essentially two ways that you can go about doing it. Well, one, you can improve capital, improve your production processes, or you can find a way to drive down wages. In Marx, both types of behavior would count as exploitation, right? Maybe driving down wages is more obvious and immediate to see, because then there you have this surplus value created. But also, if the value of capital improves and wage laborers are not compensated, or they do not get to share in the fruits of those improvements of capital that they created, then in Marx, this is exploitation. So Marx says that you can measure the surplus as the difference between the marginal product of labor, which exceeds the cost of the worker, and this is a measure of capitalist exploitation. In order to ensure this exploitation, Marx believed that capitalists would maintain what he called a reserve army of the unemployed. And this is, of course, just a bunch of unemployed people who pose a threat to the working people. And that threat is, well, if you don't like your job or the job conditions, then we'll just fire you and replace you with somebody who will do it. And so we talked in class about how this might apply to the real world. I brought up the example recently of meat packing industry and how it seemed that the meat packers there didn't really have access to breaks, to proper medical care. They were told essentially they'd just be fired if they wanted to pursue outside medical care or anything like that. In class, some students brought up examples apparently coming up of the Amazon warehouses where people are, they have quotas that they have to fill. And if they don't fill the quotas, they might be fired. So they have to work fast and hard. They feel like they can't take breaks, lunches, and things like that. So this would be a reserve army of the unemployed type of concept, right? Why would people think that they can't take a break, because they need to fulfill this quota? Well, because the idea is that if you don't do it, we'll find somebody who will. Right, so then labor under capitalism and all other class-based societies in Marx is neither truly voluntary or entirely for the benefit of the workers themselves. It's involuntary because the workers are forced by their lack of ownership to sell their labor power to capitalists or else starve. And then capitalists use their privileged position to exploit workers, basically improving capital, improving profits and surplus, monopolizing industries, and appropriating more of the value of workers' labor. So finally, why is this a problem? Or what's ultimately going to happen then, leading into some of the predictions of Marx. Ultimately, in the Communist Manifesto and some of Marx's writings, Marx writes that the working class would revolt and attempt to create a new classless society, and this comes from the theory of alienation as a result of exploitation of the working class. So Marx believed that workers under exploitation and under capitalism in these class-based societies would be alienated from society in 4 ways. They would be alienated from their final product. So they don't really, if you're working at a factory line, you're not seeing the final product for the most part. You may not have a very good idea of how it's built. And so you don't really have a sense of pride in what you've created. Marx gives the example of a clockmaker, says that, a clockmaker crafts their trade and refines it and are usually very proud of what they've created. People working in a factory did not get to live life like the clockmaker. They only, stood there doing their routine task. Alienation from the productive process means that you can't really build human capital if you don't really understand how whatever you're doing is being built or the process at large. You're not going to be able to ultimately, say, branch off and start your own business or anything like that. So you're alienated from the human capital, physical capital aspect of it. Alienation from self-identity and innate potential. We already referenced that a little bit. If you're giving up your passion pursuits in order to earn wage labor, then that is going to cause you to feel alienated. And finally, alienation from other workers. First of all, classes form. You have a working class that earns very little, and then people who are trying to distinguish themselves socially from the working class. Also alienation from other working class individuals, just in the sense that these jobs were not very social or interactive. Generally speaking, you would probably, stand on a factory line and do one task all day. And so there's not a lot of socialization, not a lot of co-work, anything like that. Ultimately, Marx says capitalism involves the objectification, commonization of the experiences and activities of the working class. Workers are trained to think of their time as money and to trade their time for money, their work power for money to survive. So finally, we see some summary and predictions from Marx. Marx believes that capitalism is the most efficient and productive system that the world has ever seen, but that the pressures of capitalism would ultimately lead to industrial monopolization, more power of the ownership class. The working class would have to sell its labor for subsistence, and as markets monopolize, the ownership class would become more powerful in determining wages, extracting surplus and exploiting workers' productive capabilities. Less of the gains from capital improvements would go to workers, more to the capitalists. And so Marx feared that eventually conditions would become so bad for the working class, poor living conditions, job unhappiness, alienation in general, that it would lead to a proletariat uprising. We see this list of demands in the Communist Manifesto, and some of them are, I guess, somewhat reasonable in terms of what we would see from a kind of progressive platform in the modern era, especially, no child slave labor, improved public education and services, sewage, expansion of public parks and public use lands. But then we also see what ultimately becomes known as communism. And of course, Marx is considered the father of communism, having essentially coined or defined this term at length. And that really comes from this removal of private property and inheritance. And so in class, we've been thinking about some of the modern revolutions of the 20th century and whether Marx's predictions are somewhat accurate, especially thinking about, going forward into the modern day. Is it reasonable to think that in a country like the United States, where even the working class does own private property, that people would revolt and want to remove private property? It seems far-fetched to me, but, if that's just an opinion. All right, so this is really all we're going to say about the Communist Manifesto. We see these predictions, and really, in my readings of Marx, I find that Marx meant the Communist Manifesto and his other writings as to be normative, referring to what is or what would be. Marx felt that due to alienation, exploitation, the pressures of capitalism, the working class would revolt, rather than as a positive piece referring to what should or ought to be. So while Marx is commonly associated with socialist command economy movements such as Che Guevara in Guatemala and Cuba, the formation of USSR, we also know that Marx was somewhat critical of at least the movements that went on during his time. Some of the socialist utopians that we talked about in an earlier section, Marx was critical of. He believed that those dreams were either unattainable dreams or didn't solve the problems, the pressures inherent in the class-based system, in the capitalist system. It's also not clear that Marx believed that revolution was desirable, although he did believe that it was unavoidable. Most notably, Marx's legacy seems to be with Bolshevism in the formation of the USSR. And so there seems to have been some effort to create a classless society without private ownership, which ultimately led to a command economy rather than to worker ownership. So some economists believe that what happened in the USSR ended up being a little bit more akin to feudalism than to socialism, where you had an aggregation of power, ultimately leading to Stalinism in the Reign of Terror. Now, the USSR did go on for some time after Stalin, and conditions did improve. Nonetheless, the USSR disbanded around 1990. In class, we'll probably talk a little bit about the USSR and then the reformation, the restructuring of the Soviet former states. So that's something you can kind of look into on your own. Always a good paper topic or idea. And finally, we're going to end with some quick definitions economically, what these three terms mean. And it might differ somewhat from what these terms mean kind of culturally or socially, but capitalism we think of as individuals or firms. Usually firms own the means of production. Sometimes individuals own firms. Private property is common and determined in markets. The ownership is determined in markets. government intervention in markets is possible to correct market failures. In socialism, workers own the means of production. Private property is still common, and government intervention is a primary method of enforcing the voting will of the working class. So perhaps more role of government intervention. And ultimately, I think in the cultural or social sphere, we often talk more about socialism as tax. And of course, tax is consistent with capitalism and government intervention, which we'll see especially in Keynes and some of our kind of more modern economics. Communism or command communism, you have a central government which owns the means of production, private property is uncommon, and government intervention is the primary means of allocative and distributive decisions. Right, so again, these are what the terms mean kind of economically, theoretically. Do they mean the same thing in culture? Not exactly sure. All right, so that's it for this video. In the next video, we will talk about transition period from feudalism to capitalism, what it looked like, and how ultimately we end up defining capitalism.